I'd like to remind you that for more Microsoft webcasts, you can go to microsoft.com/webcast. Thanks again for joining us for today's presentation, MSDN Webcast, Visual C# 2010 Soup to Nuts. This is Part 2, Visual C# Express. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, Bill Steele, Senior Developer Evangelist for Microsoft. Bill, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Sydney, and welcome back, everybody, to this second in this long series of webcasts on C# Soup to Nuts. Today we are actually going to be looking at the developer environment that Microsoft provides free of charge for developing C# applications, and that product is called Visual C# Express. So starting off, we're going to talk about first off, where you can get it. We'll take you out to the website where you can actually download the tool set. And then we'll go ahead and walk through the tool set pretty much at a very beginner's level here. And like I said, as we develop further through this webcast series, we'll begin using more and more advanced features of Visual C# Express. So we'll take a look today by starting off at the basic environment, how you navigate around it. And then we'll dig down into the actual project structure itself and see how the files and any documents that you have associated with your project are actually organized. And then we'll dig into the different types of designers and editors that you use to actually build your application. And we'll wrap up today's session with a quick look at the debugging features and of building an application and how you can use Visual Studio along that way to help you make more reliable applications. So starting off, downloading Visual C# Express is actually relatively straightforward. Microsoft.com/Visual Studio. Again, Visual C# Express is a free product along with a whole bunch of other companion products that are in the Express lineup, from Visual Basic Express to C++ Express, and even some custom tools particular to the environments that they're designed for. So where do you get Visual C# Express? I'm actually going to go to the next slide here, which is going to take me out to the view sharing demo where I'm going to share out my desktop. And my screen is set to 1024 by 768. If you want to see my screen, full screen on your computer, if your resolution is that or higher, you can press the F5 key to maximize the display, and you'll be able to see my entire screen. So I've switched over to my desktop now, and as I launch my Internet Explorer browser here, you'll see it takes me out to the Microsoft.com/Visual Studio homepage. And over here, there are several tabs along the top here that take you out to various locations. The one we're interested in is the Products tab. In the center column for the Products tab is all of the free editions of the Express editions of Visual Studio. The first one in the list here is a version of Visual Studio designed explicitly for building websites. The next three are language-specific versions of Visual Studio. So we have the Visual Basic, C# and the C++ editions that allow you to build applications in and around those types of languages. And we're interested today in C# Express. And this last one is the latest entry into the collection of Express products, and that's the edition designed for allowing you to build Windows Phone 7-based applications. And within that tool set, you can actually build either Visual Basic or C# applications. So we're going to take a look at the C# Express edition. And I do want to point out some interesting resources on this page. Not only does it have a bunch of the marketing speak about, what C# Express has in it, but it also has over here on the right a language-specific download tool. So you can pick your language of choice and then click the Install Now button. And that'll simply launch a little installer that's, in this case, the Visual C# _web.exe. Simple little web application installer, if you will, that will automatically download the components that you choose and install them. Since I already have C# installed, I'm not going to go through that. But I do want to point out some of the other features on this website. And the most important one is this Resources tab. This Resources tab actually takes you out to a bunch of additional resources that you can use to learn and develop around C#. The Express editions do have to be registered, and if you just click on this link, it'll take you out there to the registration site that will give you the serial number that Visual Studio will ask you for. After about 30 days of use, it'll pop up a dialog box asking you to enter it. It's free of charge. We just like to know who you are. and what kinds of interests you have. The other things that we can do on this page is we'll take you out to a website here that will actually take you out to learning how to build desktop-based applications. We'll talk about out here all the tools. There are tons and tons of videos, all kinds of content out there available for building C# applications or any type of application for that matter. In addition to the desktop style development, we can also develop for other platforms. So, for example, you might want to build for Xbox or you might want to build for Windows Phone. By going out to this site here, you can actually download the tools and then drill down through here and learn about building for those other types of platforms. For example, we just introduced the Windows Phone Developer Tools 7.1 beta, which allows you to build applications for the upcoming release of Windows Phone, codenamed Mango. And this would be where you would go and learn about building those types of applications. And again, that's a free tool that's available. And then some of the other things that I'd like to point out here is beyond just my own series, but there are several other types of series that are available for learning C#. Specifically, we have this series on How Do I videos. These are very similar to my Soup to Nut videos. They actually walk you through specific tasks as opposed to the general language. But you can learn quite a bit by watching this series as well. So I highly encourage you to dig into the other sites that are available off of this site and learn about building your applications. Okay, so back over to my slide deck here. I do want to encourage you to ask questions. If you have any, please feel free to ask them. I will answer them at any time I come back from the sharing slides. When I come back into the slide deck, I can see the question and answer panel here, and I'll just answer them verbally. So we have them recorded for anybody watching this in the future as well. So the Visual C# Express IDE, or Integrated Development Environment, is actually the development environment that we use for building C# applications. Very similar to the way I built the applications last week with Notepad. Visual Studio allows you to type in, using a text editor, the code that you need to actually execute. But it also includes a whole bunch of other features. Specifically, it has the compilers that you're going to need, and it has a whole bunch of frameworks around, the specific task of building applications. Some of the interesting things that the IDE does for you is that it actually, as you type in your code, it's monitoring what you're typing, and it's actually technically pre-compiling part of your application to understand if you're using the functionality correctly or not. So it will highlight any errors that you might type in your code, but it will also help you along the way. It'll give you hints about what kind of code, what kinds of code is available for the particular section of the application that you're writing at that point in time. And it does this using both the syntax checker and the IntelliSense of the actual code editor. Now, those two features are incredibly important, and as you're building your applications, you're going to become very reliant on those to help you understand the correct syntax, the correct usage of functions, and the types of different types of functions that you can use. You will begin to use those tools and realize just how powerful they are when you start getting into very complex applications, and specifically when you're using functionality that you did not write, you're using somebody else's functionality. This IntelliSense and this syntax checking allows you to basically see what the other developers had in mind. We do this with the code editor, but there's also another type of development that you'll do with Visual Studio, and that's one of the primary reasons it's called Visual C#, that we have these concept of designers. A designer is a visual way of building your application. So instead of building your application by writing all the code yourself, we actually have tools that allow you to, for example, build a window. So we will have a basic window shape, and then you can use the toolbox, and you can drag items out of the toolbox and drop them onto this designer, this Windows editor, the Windows Form Editor, that allows you to visually design the application using a very simple drag-and-drop methodology. But underneath the covers, what Visual Studio is actually doing is it's building out the code that is needed to generate that window for you, so you don't have to do all the work yourself. And that's actually an incredible time saver. And there's not just a designer for forms. There's designers for any type of visual element that you might be dealing with when you're building an application in C#. So we have WPF and Silverlight and all kinds of other designers, including things like database designers and things like that. So those are going to be incredibly helpful for you when you're building an application. So moving on, once you actually have an understanding of the IDE itself, you have to have an understanding of how things are organized within the environment. And the way we organize them is what we call, in a way, what we call a solution. A solution is actually basically, think about it as a hierarchy. It's the top level of your project. So the solution contains everything that there is that you need to deal with building your application. Within that solution, you might have multiple projects. So, for example, you might have an application that utilizes parts of the web and maybe another part that uses Silverlight. So you can run Silverlight in web applications, and you can also run them standalone, but they might be a part of the same solution. However, from Visual Studio standpoint, those are two different types of projects. So you would have two projects within the one solution or more. You might even have a database project, for example, when you're dealing with a data store like SQL Server or something like that. Then from within that project, you're going to break that down even further into individual folders for the different types of content that you might have. So, for example, again, on a website, you might have pages dealing with the home page, the default .aspx or whatever. And you might have subpages underneath that, so you would architect them into, folders. You might also even have images or other types of content associated with your application stored and, categorized under different types of folders. And then naturally within those folders you would have the individual files themselves. And that's just the way we actually manage the project structure from within Visual Studio. So starting off at the highest level with the solution, all the way down to the lowest level with the files themselves. So let's pop out and take a look at our instance of Visual C# Express that we have that we'll be using again for the rest of the this webcast series, and we'll take a look at some of these features that make it an ideal environment for building C# applications. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and launch C# Express. I have it here on my toolbar. And you can see right away that we break the window up into several different panes. And when you install C# Express, it actually asks you how you want it organized. And I generally choose the C# method regardless of which version of Visual Studio I'm using. I happen to like the layout the way it actually organizes things. But you can tailor this however you want to by going to the Tools, Customize, or the Tools Options. So both of these allow you to actually change the organization and layout of things. So, for example, maybe you like a little bit larger font. You can simply choose the font size that you want and hit OK. And then from that point on, any of the windows that you're using that deal with that font will have that larger font. So we have our classic menu structure at the top. So File, Edit, View, Debug. Debug is going to be one that we're going to be using quite a bit because that's where you're going to be able to execute your code and analyze what's going on while it's running. Along the left side here, we have these panels that are basically expandable windows that we can either dock in place or let collapse. So we can have multiple windows, and we can place these on either the left side or the right side. As a matter of fact, in this particular case, I actually have one of them on the right side called the Solution Explorer that's actually pinned, so it's actually automatically open, and I can unpin that and it will collapse, whereas over on this side I have the Data Explorer always collapsing. In the primary section of the screen here, we have what we call the Start page. And C# is similar to the other Visual Studio products where we have the Start page that allows us to deal with our most recently used projects or create a new one, as well as to simple click on the previous message or the previous projects that we were working with. And then over here on the center portion of the screen, we actually have a kind of like an integrated web browser control that allows us to actually drill down and go through the tutorials that are built into C# Express. And then there's a tab over here that allows us to actually see what's available out on the web through the RSS subscription. So we can actually click on the link, subscribe to what's new out there, and actually get up-to-date news right from within our start page about what's going on with Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm going to create a new project, and I can do this through the File menu, clicking the new project, or I can simply click the new project from the start page here. And what you see right away is that in my particular case, I have a whole bunch of additional types of apps installed. But the basic Visual C# application that we're going to build is going to be a class library or a console application, similar to the one we did last week. In fact, I'm going to write the exact same application that we did in the last episode. And I'm just going to click OK. And you'll see what it's done is it's given me pretty much the same framework that I built last week. It did, however, add a couple extra bits of code that we don't need for this application, so I'm just going to remove them just to make it the same application that we had as last week. And then if you remember last week, it was a console application, and all we did was do a console.writeLine, W-R-I-T-E, spelled correctly, hello world. And again, we have our curly braces opening and closing each of the sub-blocks. Notice how Visual Studio is very nice, though, in that it formats our text for us correctly. As a matter of fact, I can even mess up the formatting, and if I hit Control-K, Control-D, it will automatically reformat it for us correctly. That's actually a shortcut that I use all the time whenever I'm typing in code, to have it automatically format and indent things based on where they exist in the class structure. So in this case, what I've done is I've built the same exact application that we wrote last week. And if I go ahead and run this, you'll see that it, I don't know if the webcast shows this very clearly or not, but what happened is it popped up an instance of the command prompt window, ran my code, and then immediately exited, and the command prompt window exited right out. The reason it did that is because our application didn't tell it what to do, so it didn't tell it to wait around. If I launched the command prompt myself and ran my application in it, then we would see the results stay in that window. It won't shut it down. But because the Visual Studio actually started the application, when the application finished, it went ahead and shut it back down. So we need to make sure that if we're going to build an application this way, we want to make sure that our application kind of sticks around so that we can actually see the results. And I'm going to do that very simply by doing a console.readKey, which is basically going to tell the console to sit around and wait until I press a key before I exit the application. So now when I rerun this application, I get my hello world, and it stays there persistent until I actually press any key. So here I just hit a key, and now it'll go away. So that's the only change I made from last week's code. We get the exact same thing functionally. However, you'll notice that there are a few differences here. First off, the Solution Explorer actually contains a lot more than just the actual program that I wrote. So here's the program that I wrote, the program.cs file. And in it, though, you'll notice that we have the console solution itself, or the console solution up here. We have the console application itself, which is the project file. And then we have some files that actually indicate some additional properties about this. Visual Studio is a much more powerful environment than, obviously, our Notepad editor from last week. But it pretty much does the same thing for you from the basic standpoint. But it also adds a whole lot of additional functionality that allows you to make more enterprise-ready applications. And that's what this other set of functionality is. Now, last week, we also did a couple other programs. For example, I showed how to call a function in another class. And we can emulate that exact same thing here. So I can just simply create a new class. Now, if you remember from last week, we have to prepend this with the word public. Public class, and we'll do a void, we'll call this, public class my code. We'll just call it my code. Public class, spelled correctly. And then from this public class, we'll go ahead and put a static method that's going to basically do something for us. So static void say hello, and then our console.writeLine. So now what I've done is I've created a second class, which is a second block of code. Now normally when you're building a very big project, you might want to keep both classes in separate files. But just for the sake of demonstration here today, I went ahead and put them in the same file. But notice that they do fall under the same namespace, though. And if you do it in a separate file, you want to make sure that that separate file has the appropriate namespace. In our case, if we don't want to reference the namespace every time, we would just use the same one. And again, in the future, in the next episode, we'll already talk about classes more in detail. We'll actually talk about the namespace usage. But in this case, now what I want to do is say I want to actually have this block of code actually call into this block of code. And because I marked this as static, I don't have to create an instance of the code. So all I have to do is simply call it. So my code dot say hello. Now you'll notice that the IntelliSense didn't pick that up just yet. And as I hover over it, it says it's inaccessible due to its protection level. In this case, we have to say public as well. We have to tell it that it's public because whenever we are using C# code, we need to tell it whether this is a security model, basically saying that we need to allow people to call this code or not allow them. And if I don't use the public keyword, it's basically saying, hey, nobody is allowed to call this except my own internal members. But by adding that public keyword, you'll notice that we automatically got that little helper that said, okay, now I see everything is okay. And that's actually a really, really important concept to understand here. Also, when I hover over this, now when I type this in, you see when I hit the period, I actually get the IntelliSense saying, okay, hello, or say hello, is actually a valid method that I can call. And not only that, we can also see what its signature is. We can see that it returns nothing and it takes no parameters. So I can simply use the tab key to select that and finish out the line, and now I have a valid call. So now when I run my code, not only am I going to get hello world, but on the second line of code, it's going to go ahead and call down here and execute this line, and then it'll resume back up here and then pause and wait for me to press any key. So we should see two lines of text, hello world and hello, and it's sitting there waiting for me to press the key. So I can press any key and the application will exit. So that's let's go ahead and save that as console application 1. That's a very simple look at the IDE and how the tools work from the perspective of a text editor. Let's go back over to our slide deck. There are no questions in the queue right now, so we'll go ahead and move right on to the code editor. I kind of skipped ahead just a little bit, but this is actually helpful. We're going to see some cool things happening here in a second. The code editor, which you just saw me using, does check your syntax, and it does give you hints, IntelliSense, on how you actually use that. But what I didn't show you is that it also allows you to manage breakpoints and set places in your code where you would like the execution to stop so you could actually observe other things. The other thing that I didn't show you was that it is a multiple document interface, which means that when you're building an application, you are going to have multiple files that you're working with, and you want to be able to manage those multiple files in such that you can edit one or the other one, especially when you're moving into a scenario where you have a team development environment where you have multiple people working on the code. You want to be able to have them individually work on the code so you don't have conflicts. One of the other features I didn't show you was the forms designers themselves, or the various types of designers. We talked about them earlier, but in this next part I want to show you them and point out that there are more than just a simple basic form designer. In fact, there are all kinds of designers throughout all of the products of Visual Studio that allow you to, build websites or build Windows forms or XAML forms or, Silverlight WPF or even databases and XML documents. We have designers specifically around them. So back over to our demo. In this case, we'll go ahead and bring up the same application that I just built, but I'm going to actually create a new project or a new file here. It's going to be a class, and we're just going to create a class. So now it's called Class 1. Notice that the namespace is still console application 1, which is the same as this namespace. If that's the case, then we don't have to do anything exceptional here. And I'm actually just going to copy this code and paste it over into this class. And I'm going to change a couple things. When we look at this class, this is a public class, my code. Actually, we'll just leave it the same. It's just called Class 1. But I've put this same public static void hello, say hello in there. And I'm just going to say this is hello from Class 1. And when I save this and go back over here, instead of calling my code, we're going to call this class 1, notice that we get the same hello method. Oops. There we go. So instead of calling this version of it, it's going to call this other one in a separate file. And you can see here that I have this multiple document interface that allows me to edit those individually. I can even unpin those if I want and move them around and show both of them at the same time. I can pin this to the side and have, 2 different windows. Notice that when I drag this around, I get this toolbar or tool in the middle that allows me to dock each individual window. So in this case, I can dock one on top of the other one, and I can see both sets of code simultaneously. And I can, edit one and run the other one at the same time. So again, running this, I now have hello world and hello from class 1. Again, it's waiting for me to press a key before it exits. So that just shows you the multiple document interface aspects of this. Now, I want to move on and create a new project. In this case, instead of a console app, we're going to go ahead and build the Windows app just like we did last week. And the Windows app that we built last week, we actually used, where this says Form 1, we actually had the text Hello World. And I can go ahead and do that by actually just setting the property of text 1 instead of setting it in code like I did last week. So we can simply say Hello World here. And the nice thing about the designer is that I get an actual visual representation of what my application is going to look like without running the code. If I go ahead and run this code, you'll see that I get an exact copy of that, including all of the Chrome with the minimize, maximize, the context menu, and even the ability to exit. Now, this little bit of code that you see right here in the middle, this little block that you see right in here, this is actually just an artifact of our live meeting presenting. It recognizes this window and it puts that above every little window, so you can ignore that. When you run this, you should just see a window that looks plain Jane just like this one here. So what I can do now is I can use the designer aspects of this and maybe change the height and width of this. I can go over to the toolbox here, and I can even pull out items out of here. Let's place a label on there, and let's place a button on there. And now that I have those, I can use the designer aspects of this and set some of those properties. So, hello world. And on the button, I can make it say, click me. I can use the designer to change, for example, the font size. Maybe I want something that's a little bigger, or maybe a different font altogether. So we can change this to a, let's actually pick the font, choose the font designer here and make that a 20-point font. And actually we'll just make it bold oblique, whatever that means. So there we go. And we can do the same thing for the button. We can make its font a little larger, make it a little bit bolder. And I can use the designer to change the aspects of that button. Now when I run the application, I get my hello world, similar, just as the same aspect of, same view as we had in our designer. We have a real-time view of it now that we're running. When I click the Click Me button, however, nothing happens. And just like last week, we had code that described the window. Well, this week we actually have code that describes the window as well, but we don't actually write the code. Simply using the designer allows us to, the designer writes the code for us. And the way it does that is the designer knows what code is associated with, for example, a button or this label. Last week, we actually wrote all the code ourselves. Well, this week, using the designer, it's actually writing the code for us. It's created this class called Form 1, and it's added the label and the buttons to it. And in fact, not only has it done that, hidden in here in this collapsible portion is actually where it sets all the properties. Just like we set the text property last week, it's setting the text property this week. In addition to that, it also has properties that it is setting on the button itself. Now, the one thing that we're missing from this portion is any place for us to write our own custom code. Now, the way we do that in here, for example, let's say I wanted to respond to the Click Me event. When somebody clicks on this button, I want to be able to change this text. I can simply double-click on this designer, and it will bring up the code window that allows me to actually rewrite the code that's associated with this label control. So to do that, I'm just going to take this label that we have on the screen, and I'm going to change its text property to You Clicked Me. Again, we have that same hierarchy with the brackets. We end each line that's executable with a semicolon. When I run this code now, whenever I click the Click Me button, I'm going to get the text "You click me" placed in that button. Now, I can click that multiple times. It's automatically setting it every time. However, we haven't cleared out the previous value, so we'll still see that it doesn't change. But every time I do run this, I will get the new text in there, "You click me." So hopefully that gives you a quick little understanding of the actual Windows Form Designer here. There are other types of designers in here. As a matter of fact, if I do add any type of new item to this, I get the Visual C# items. As I go through here, you can see some of these actually have different icons associated with them. So I can build an about box, or I can build a Windows form, or I can build connectivity to a database, or XML files, or data types, or whatever they happen to be. A lot of these are designers that are visual as opposed to being text-based designers. So you can take advantage of that to build your application. In addition to that, we have the toolbox over here that allows us to add any type of control that we want that we've built, or that comes with Windows, or even that we've purchased from third parties. And the way these work is it's a simple drag and drop experience. You pick out the control that you want, and you may take it and drop it onto the screen. So in that case, there's a calendar, and now I have a calendar in my app, and when I run it, I'm going to have the calendar right there in the middle. And you can see that this is a fully functioning application, a component, if you will, that you can then take advantage of in your application. So that's the Windows Forms Designer. All right, so let me pop back over to my code, or my slide deck here. Again, there are no questions in the queue here, so the last part of today's talk is going to be around this concept of building an application and then understanding how it is actually working, what's going on underneath the covers. And we do that through a feature of Visual Studio called the Integrated Debugger. The Integrated Debugger allows us to write an application and examine it at runtime. So when we're actually running the application, instead of us just testing it and watching what's happening, we can actually test it and have Visual Studio report to us certain events that are occurring inside of there, or the certain values of the states of variables and things like that. And you can do this through the Integrated Debugger. By default, when you hit F5 in Visual Studio, that's in other words, when you run an application, we run it with the debugger attached. If you hit Control F5, that's actually running the application without the debugger attached. And there's uses for both of them. But debugging is always going to occur with the debugger attached. And then once you're done debugging it, you can actually retest your application without the debugger attached to make sure that there's no adverse effects from the debugger, for example. And you can run your application at its full native speed with the Control F5 way of executing it. So you can run it with debugger and without by hitting F5 or Control F5. Now, one of the important aspects of debugging is the ability to have the application pause at a certain point in time so that you can actually look at a particular area of interest. And with Visual Studio, the way we do that is we set what's called a breakpoint on a particular line of code. And hitting a breakpoint or setting a breakpoint is actually really easy. It's a simple matter of pressing the F5 or F9 key on the line of code that you want to examine. And what will happen is when Visual Studio sees that your code actually is getting to that point, it'll actually pause your application, return you to Visual Studio, and highlight the line of code that it's getting ready to execute. At that point in time, and under certain conditions, if you need to, you can actually change that line of code or any future line of code that you're getting ready to execute. That's a feature that we call Edit and Continue. What will happen is instead of the application being compiled and run and then tested, when we have a breakpoint placed, every time you start editing a line of code, right before we resume, we'll actually recompile that portion of the app that changed. And if available, will allow you to continue running. There are going to be certain situations where the line of code that you changed is actually going to break something that's already executed. And if that's the case, we won't allow you to continue. Instead, we'll stop the debugging and we'll restart the application. But the breakpoints have another feature that's incredibly important, and that's we actually store the state, the stack, and all the memory, everything that's in memory at that point in time, and we allow you to examine that through a couple different features like the watch window and tooltips that allow you to see what's going on in the application as it currently is at the point in time when the code is executing. And that's actually a really, really handy feature that allows you to debug the app without having to resort to some unquality style, printing of code, printing of variables out to, like we did in the old days, printed out to a printer so we could see what was going on. In this case, we can simply hover over, for example, a variable, and we can see what value is currently stored in that variable. And there's some really powerful features within the debugging environment that lets you do that. So let's pop back over to the sharing demo here and take a look at actually debugging this application. So I'm actually going to bring back up this button click here, and I'm going to place a breakpoint right on the code here. Now this breakpoint, simply by clicking on this quarter-inch wide bar over here, I can set a breakpoint on any line of code that I want. And by clicking it or clicking again, that will remove it. And what will happen is now when I run the code, if I hit the Click Me button, instead of it actually executing that code, it actually pauses inside of Visual Studio and then highlights that line in yellow by default. And it also places this yellow error next to the line of code that's going to be executed next. As a matter of fact, this arrow you can actually drag around and place this anywhere where it's valid executable code so that you can actually edit and continue or, reprocess a line, for example, if you wanted to do that. So for debugging purposes, that's pretty handy. The other thing that I want to point out here, though, is that while we're in this state, while the application is actually paused, you see that we have an interesting looking set of icons here. We have the continue and we have the stop debugging. They're both highlighted, both available to us simultaneously. Normally, it's either one or the other. But what I'd like to show right now is this concept of hovering the cursor over any of the objects. As I hover over any of those objects, what I actually get is a little bit of tooltip information about the properties on that particular object. So in this case, I'm hovering over the word text. And the word text is actually a text property of the label of the application, which is, by the way, this means this application. And you can see that the value of this currently is Hello World, and that this line of code is actually getting ready to reassign that value from Hello World over to You Clicked Me. And I can actually hover over this, and if I do this just right, I can move over and click this little pin, and what that pin will do is that'll place that tooltip help right next to the line that we're executing, and I can then press the F10 key, which is Execute Next Statement. And you see now this line of code has changed from the Hello World to You Click Me. So it's actually allowing me to see the value of this variable regardless of what state it's in. If I continue to run this, if I stop this and rerun it, again I have the value. Click Me here. It's Hello World right now. And as I, again, hit F10, you'll see that value will change to You Click Me. So that's a very handy feature that allows you to kind of get a quick view of what an individual variable or an object looks like. Not only can you do that with an individual one, but you can actually look at an entire object or an entire collection of objects, and you can actually use the plus key to drill down in and to look at the states of the various objects that are in there. So, for example, we have a button and we have a label on our main form. And here's the button, and it has a text property called Click Me. And we have a label, and it has a text property called You Click Me. So we've already assigned that there. So we can see multiple states of multiple objects within this. Very, very handy little debugging feature there. And we could take advantage of that in multiple ways. Now, right now, we're using the Express Edition. If you are a professional developer, in the higher-end editions of Visual Studio, we actually have a lot more control over what we can do with this breakpoint. For example, we can actually set up parameters on this breakpoint so that it would only occur, say, for example, if the button was clicked on the third time, or, if the value of another variable was 5, then have it break. So you can actually set up different types of breakpoints on there. So that's a very handy little feature of Visual Studio. Now that debugging experience is not just for the current window that you're in, but if I go back and open up, say, for example, that other project that I was just on, let me open it this way, Recent Projects, Console Application. Now remember, in this application we had 2 classes, so we have the second one. In this case, I'm going to set a breakpoint on this line. I can also set a breakpoint on this line so we can actually watch how this works. When I run this, we hit our first breakpoint, okay, and I have 3 little controls up here that control how I actually deal with moving to the next statement. If you remember earlier, I drug the arrow up, and I can actually drag this back up again, and you can see that the next line of code that's going to execute is Hello World again. And if I hit F10, if we go back over to our application, you can see it actually executed that line of code twice because it executed it on the first time, and then when I dragged the line, when I told it to re-execute that line of code, it did faithfully and printed the Hello World out again. If I look at these 3 icons up here, though, you'll notice one says Step Into, one says Step Over, and one says Step Out Of. What those allow me to do is they allow me to say, for example, in this one, I would like to continue one line at a time into this method call. So as I do that, you can see it starts out at this first one. Even though I have a breakpoint down here already, it's basically saying, okay, I want a breakpoint on every line. So as I do that, I get this ability to step through that one line at a time. If I rerun this and use the second one, this says Step Over. I have the breakpoint in that second line of code. When I do the Step Over, it actually does break on that. But if I turn that breakpoint off and rerun this, again, if I use this first one, it'll step right into that code and allow that to run. But if I do this from the second one, notice that it didn't go into that other class library. It simply stayed out here at the root and just continued to run. However, it did pause on the very next line. Now the other one that I can do is I can turn this breakpoint off. I can set a breakpoint inside of here, and when I run this, it actually is breaking inside this library. I have the option of saying, okay, step out of this. So if I have an additional breakpoint here, for example, or additional lines of code below this, it's basically going to say, okay, continue running all of these, but then stop at the next line outside of that. And that's just exactly what it did. So we can see our output is Hello World and from the class, and when I hit my space bar, actually it will return back out to me. So we have this ability to debug not only in the individual file that I'm in, but any of the other sub-projects that I'm in as well. So as long as I have the source code available in my Solution Explorer over here, I have the ability to edit and debug any of that code. Now, one other feature I want to point out is something that we call Edit and Continue. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint on this line right here. We'll go ahead and run this. Now you'll notice right now the code says Hello World. Let's just add a little bit of edited text to that. Because I haven't run that code yet, this is perfectly valid. I can now run this again and actually just continue this. And you see instead of it just saying Hello World, it's actually printed out Hello World edited text. It's allowed me to change this program dynamically while I was in the middle of executing it. Now you want to be careful with this because this would be good for small applications and small debugging scenarios. However, or obvious errors that you've made in your code. However, the one problem with this is that if you make a major change, it's possible that it will force you to stop and recompile the application. So in this case, I'm calling class 1 say hello, and if I wanted to change this to say my code, I can simply replace this. Okay, in this case, I changed the entire sequence of the code, and it allowed me to do that. But if I was to, say, put the breakpoint on this line of code and run this and change this to class 1, when I run this, it might actually, depending on the scenario, it might actually say, hey, you can't do that because this one relies on the other one. So, for example, if I was changing the console class instead, it might come back and say, oh, you cannot do that. That's not valid to change at this point in time. So you want to be careful how you're doing that. Again, the other one that you can do there is when you have your code, when you do have a breakpoint set, for example, and you have code executing, if I change this to my code and I drag this back up here and rerun it, in this case it allowed me to do that, you can see that now I have both sets of code. So I have the edited text that I edited earlier, I have the hello world from class 1, and I have the edited text and the hello world, where I actually changed the entire call sequence altogether here from the debugger. Using edit and continue, and now it's sitting here waiting for me to press the key. Again, if I wanted to, I could drag this back up again, continue that, and now I have 3 sets of that code actually being executed. So there's a lot of fun things here you can do with the edit and continue. Edit and continue is a feature that's available in both VisualBasic.net as well as C#. It was actually originally only available for years and years inside of Visual Basic, and it was a feature that was asked for quite often inside of C#, and it actually just came out about, just a few years ago, available to C#, because it's actually a pretty technical challenge underneath the covers to actually get that to work just right. Okay, back over to our slide deck here. That actually is our last demo, and I don't see any questions in the queue. So today what we did is we took a look at the Visual C# environment. We saw where we can download it. We saw, how we can navigate around it and how the projects themselves are actually organized. And then we dug into the code editors and designers and saw how we can actually use those to help build our applications much more rapidly. And then lastly, once we build our application, we need to be able to test it. And I am of the firm belief, by the way, in case any of you are interested, that you code a little and test a lot. So there's a paradigm out there called test-driven development, where you generally will write your tests first, and you would write your code to actually make the tests pass. That is a very handy way of doing that. And the debugger is an incredible tool for helping you actually build those applications. But coding a little, testing a lot. Write one line of code, test it 4 or 5 times. And every time you write some code, you want to make sure you have tests already designed that will help you that code succeed. So next week we're going to be taking a look at the class libraries. We have a very nice hierarchical set of building an application by using class libraries and breaking them down into subcomponents that are specific to certain tasks. And then individually, those individual tasks are then categorized within those class libraries as individual method or function calls. So we'll explore next week how we actually build those classes and how we utilize them, and get a lot more detailed under how we actually organize a C# application. And at this point, I want to go ahead and say thank you for attending this session. My contact information, if you have any questions, is right here on the screen. Feel free to send me an email or whatever. Follow me on Twitter. I'm always talking about cool things like today. I don't know if you noticed it on my desktop, but we just announced the Connect SDK for Windows beta, and immediately I actually had it installed, and so we will, you'll see me talking about all kinds of cool technologies. And at this point, I'm actually going to go ahead and turn it back over to Sydney, where she can get you into the survey. I do want to ask you to please fill out the survey. Let us know what we're doing good, what we're doing bad, and let us know what you'd like to see in the future here. I really, really appreciate your feedback on these. Again, this is just the second in this long series. I think we're going to be doing something on the order of 20 or 25 different webcasts in this series. We've got them scheduled all the way out through September, as far as I know right now, so there's some cool stuff going on. And let us know which direction you'd like us to take. Sydney?
Thank you. I'd like to remind everyone that you can print a PDF of the slides by clicking Control-P. You can either print or save those slides locally for your convenience. You should all be seeing a survey slide in your a survey now in your slide area. Excuse me. If you could take a moment to fill it out before you log off, we do appreciate any feedback you leave for us. All you need to do is follow one of the 3 links provided to complete the evaluation. And with that, I'd like to extend a special thanks to Bill for presenting today. Thank you all for joining us. You may now disconnect from the audio portion of today's conference.